The year was 1016, and mist drifted above the Thames as London braced for a moment that would alter the course of its history. The bells tolled across the city, their sound heavy with the weight of change. Upon the throne was placed not a son of Wessex, nor a descendant of Alfred the Great, but a prince from across the northern seas. His name was Cnut, son of Sweyn Forkbeard, and with his coronation, the long struggle between Saxon and Dane reached an astonishing reversal. England, once the land that had defied the Viking tide, now bent the knee to a Danish king. For more than 2 centuries, the Vikings had been England's most relentless foes. Their longships had cut through the island's defenses, their warriors had raided towns and monasteries, and their leaders had carved out the Danelaw in the east. Alfred of Wessex had turned the tide for a time, building fortresses, organizing armies, and nurturing the idea of a united English kingdom. Yet his legacy was fragile, and his successors struggled to maintain the strength of the crown. By the reign of Ethelred, bitterly remembered as the Unready, the kingdom seemed adrift. The king sought to buy peace with heavy taxes, but silver could not keep the Danes at bay, and resentment at home deepened with every payment. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion that Cnut rose to power. His father, Sweyn Forkbeard, had briefly seized England in 1013, only to die within months, leaving the crown contested. Cnut returned to reclaim what had been won and lost, clashing with Edmund Ironside, the last hope of the old dynasty. The two men fought battle after battle in 1015 and 1016, neither willing to yield until fate intervened. Edmund died suddenly, and with him died the Saxon resistance. The throne passed entirely into Cnut's hands, and the realm that once resisted invasion became part of a Scandinavian empire. Cnut was young, perhaps no more than 20, but he carried himself with the confidence of one chosen by destiny. Unlike the raiders of his forefathers, he did not see England as a prize to be looted and abandoned. He envisioned a kingdom to be ruled, administered, and integrated into a greater whole. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded his ascent with the bluntness of fact, yet for those who lived through it, the moment must have felt like a turning of the world upside down. The coronation of Cnut was not simply a ceremony, it was the beginning of a profound transformation. England was now tied to the power of Denmark, and soon to Norway as well, in what would become the North Sea Empire. For the first time, the English crown was part of a northern dominion that stretched across the waters, binding together peoples once divided by sword and shield. Cnut's reign would prove to be one of paradox. He was at once a conqueror and a reconciler, a Viking warlord and a Christian king, feared by his enemies, yet praised by the church. He secured his rule with ruthless determination, but he also sought legitimacy through law, marriage, and faith. For England, the years ahead would bring both order and uncertainty as the kingdom adjusted to life under a foreign sovereign whose power seemed to flow as much from the sea as from the throne. This was the dawn of Cnut's England, an age in which the tide of history carried the island into the orbit of a Danish king. It is a story of how conquest reshaped identity, how faith tempered ambition, and how one man sought to rule not as a fleeting invader, but as a sovereign who could endure. And as we follow his journey, we discover the strange truth of medieval England, that its fate was never bound by its shores, but always by the restless currents of the world beyond. Stay with this story, and you will see how Cnut the Great forged a realm that rose swiftly, glittered brightly, and vanished like the tide, yet left behind a legacy that echoes through the centuries. But to understand how a young Dane could wear England's crown, one must first look back at the long shadow the Viking tide had already cast upon the island. In order to understand how Cnut could rise as King of England, one must step back into the world that had been shaped for centuries by the Viking tide. The first shock came in the year 793, when raiders struck the island monastery of Lindisfarne. To the chroniclers of the time, it was as though the heavens had opened in warning. The monks were scattered, their holy place desecrated, and the rhythm of English life was forever disturbed. That single attack became a symbol, marking the dawn of the Viking Age in England. From that point onward, longships appeared like fleeting storms upon the horizon. Sometimes they came to raid, swift and brutal, and sometimes to settle, carving out territories where new laws, new customs, and new rulers took root. By the 9th century, vast stretches of eastern and northern England lay under what was called the Danelaw. This was more than just a conquered land. It was a cultural frontier. In these regions, Norse language mingled with Old English. Scandinavian gods lingered in place names, and the habits of two peoples rubbed together in uneasy coexistence. For the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it was a daily reminder that the island was no longer theirs alone. Yet the story of Viking England was not only one of conquest, but of resistance. The kingdom of Wessex under Alfred, later called the Great, became the beating heart of defiance. When the rest of England faltered before the invaders, Alfred held firm. He rebuilt his armies, fortified his towns with strong burhs, and used the pen as well as the sword to inspire his people. His vision was not merely to survive, but to lay the foundation for a single English kingdom. Though he never expelled the Danes completely, he forced recognition of his authority, and in doing so, planted the seeds of an English identity that could stand against foreign domination. Alfred's successors carried his work forward. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, expanded the boundaries of Wessex power, recovering territory from the Danelaw. Later kings, such as Ethelstan, pushed further, forging bonds that tied disparate regions into something that, for the first time, could truly be called the Kingdom of the English. And yet the threat of the North never vanished. Every few years, sails would rise again beyond the waves, bearing men who sought either wealth or dominion. By the turn of the 11th century, that threat had become heavier than ever. The great Scandinavian leaders were no longer raiders content with plunder. They had become kings who looked outward across the sea, envisioning realms that spanned from Norway to England. Armies now arrived not in a handful of ships, but in fleets capable of challenging the very fabric of English rule. And at the heart of this contest lay a question that had haunted the island since Lindisfarne. Could England withstand the North, or would it be remade by it? The legacy of Alfred still loomed large. His burhs still stood, his laws still resonated, and his memory remained an emblem of hope. Chroniclers and storytellers evoked his name whenever England faced new incursions, but memories could not fight battles, and the later kings of the House of Wessex struggled to match his strength. When they faltered, the cracks widened and the Vikings pressed in with renewed vigor. Thus, by the time of Cnut's arrival, England was already a land seasoned by generations of struggle with the North. It bore the scars of invasion, the marks of cultural blending, and the uneasy weight of both resistance and accommodation. Cnut did not step into a realm untouched by Scandinavians. He stepped into a land where Norsemen had been neighbors, enemies, and sometimes even allies for more than 200 years. The throne he claimed was built upon a long history of conflict and compromise, of raids that had turned into settlements, and of an island kingdom that had tried again and again to define itself against the sea. It is within this larger canvas that the drama of 1016 must be placed. For when Cnut was crowned, he was not a solitary intruder, but the culmination of a process that had begun with a lightning strike at Lindisfarne and stretched across generations. His reign would be judged against the shadow of Alfred's legacy, against the hopes of those who still believed England could stand independent of the North. And yet, paradoxically, his rule would also prove that the kingdom could absorb a foreign sovereign and still endure, reshaped but unbroken. The Viking Age in England was not a single story, but a chorus of many voices, raiders and monks, settlers and kings, defenders and dreamers. Out of that chorus emerged a new chapter, one where the Viking tide did not simply recede, but flowed into the heart of English kingship itself. And it was here, in the balance between resistance and transformation, that Cnut the Great found the stage upon which he would write his legend. Yet before Cnut could seize his chance, England had to endure the troubled reign of Ethelred, a king whose weakness opened the door to disaster. The England that Cnut would one day inherit was already weakened by years of fragile leadership. At its center stood King Ethelred, remembered with the bitter epithet the Unready. His title in Old English, unread, meant poor counsel, and it was not so much that he lacked will as that he lacked direction. For much of his long reign, stretching from 978 to 1016, England's throne seemed incapable of providing the unity and strength that the times demanded. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom, though proud of its traditions, was beset by divisions within and threats without. Local lords or ealdormen held great power in their regions, often acting in their own interest rather than that of the crown. Councils debated endlessly, while fleets from across the North Sea grew ever larger. At a time when unity was needed, mistrust and factionalism gnawed at the heart of the realm. Ethelred's response to the Viking onslaught reflected this uncertainty. Rather than meeting the invaders with consistent force, he turned again and again to the desperate tool of tribute. Heavy sums of silver, known as Danegeld, were collected from his subjects and handed over in the hope of purchasing peace. Each payment, however, only deepened the cycle. The silver funded new fleets, which soon returned to England's shores. To his people, it must have seemed as though the king was both draining their wealth and failing to defend their land. The crown's prestige diminished, and with it, the faith that the kingdom could withstand the storms pressing upon it. In the year 1002, Ethelred made a decision that would change the course of his reign, and indeed, the destiny of the entire island. Fearing plots against him, he ordered a sweeping strike against Danish settlers in England. This event, remembered as the St. Brice's Day Massacre, was intended to free the kingdom from the shadow of foreign influence. Instead, it had the opposite effect, for among those killed were kin of powerful Scandinavian leaders, including relatives of Svein Forkbeard, the formidable king of Denmark. The consequences were swift and severe. Svein, already one of the most ambitious rulers of his age, now had a personal cause to pursue war against England. What might once have remained intermittent raids became a focused campaign of conquest. For the English, the massacre not only failed to bring security, but drew down upon them a far greater enemy. It was as if Ethelred's attempt to rid his realm of danger had only summoned the very storm that would engulf it. From that moment, England lived in mounting tension. Raids intensified, silver flowed endlessly out of the kingdom, and the authority of the crown grew weaker with each passing year. The people looked to their king for strength, but found uncertainty. Chronicles written in monasteries during this period speak in tones of sorrow and frustration, of a land weary of paying, weary of fighting, and uncertain of its future. It was within this climate of mistrust and weakness that the seeds were sown for Cnut's eventual triumph. By the early 11th century, England was a realm exhausted by tribute, haunted by divisions, and confronted by enemies more determined than ever. Ethelred's reign, long and troubled, left behind not a united kingdom, but a fragile inheritance, an inheritance that would fall first to his son Edmund Ironside, and then, through war and circumstance, into the hands of a young Danish prince. Thus, when we look to the rise of Cnut, we must first see the shadows cast by Ethelred. His failures did not merely weaken a throne, they created the conditions in which a foreign conqueror could claim it. And in the story of England, the king who could not prepare became the unwilling herald of the king who would define an era. Out of Ethelred's failures came the moment for Denmark to strike, and it was Svein Forkbeard who seized it. When Svein Forkbeard, the formidable king of Denmark, set his sights on England, he struck at a kingdom already weakened by Ethelred's indecision. In 1013, his fleets crossed the North Sea and pressed inland with a speed that startled the Anglo-Saxon world. Town after town submitted, and by winter the English crown lay in his hands. Ethelred fled across the Channel to seek shelter in Normandy, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the dynasty of Alfred had come to its end. England had fallen to a foreign ruler, and Svein Forkbeard styled himself king not only of Denmark, but of England as well. Yet the triumph was fleeting. Within weeks of his conquest, Svein died suddenly, leaving his throne and his ambitions without a firm successor. The kingdom he had claimed stood once again in uncertainty. Ethelred was called back by his supporters, and the fragile order of the realm staggered on. But Svein's legacy had not vanished. He left behind a son, young yet formidable, who would not let his father's prize slip away. That son was Cnut. Cnut's rise began not in triumph, but in adversity. When his father died, the English rallied behind their old king, and Cnut was forced to retreat across the sea. For a time it appeared that the dream of a Danish England had ended as suddenly as it had begun. But in exile, Cnut did not fade. Instead, he gathered strength, resources, and resolve. Still in the vigor of youth, perhaps no older than 20, he possessed a rare combination of ambition and patience. He watched, he learned, and he waited for his chance to return. That chance came in 1015, when divisions within England grew sharper than ever. Ethelred's reign was nearing its end, his authority diminished, and his health failing. Cnut sailed back across the North Sea, this time not as a follower of his father, but as commander in his own right. With him came warriors bound by loyalty and hope of reward, men who believed that their young leader could succeed where others had faltered. Standing against him was Edmund, later called Ironside, the son of Ethelred. Unlike his father, Edmund showed vigor and courage in the face of the Danish threat. He rallied what forces he could, determined not to let the crown slip quietly from the House of Wessex. For a year, the island became the stage of relentless struggle. Battle followed battle, as neither side would yield. The chronicles recall the thunder of armies at Penselwood, Schurston, and Assandoun, places where the fate of England hung in the balance. Cnut proved himself not only as a warrior, but as a strategist. He maneuvered his forces with skill, striking at the heart of English resistance and building alliances with those willing to accept his cause. Edmund, though valiant, was forced into a cycle of desperate defense. Time and again he gathered his armies, struck with courage, and yet found himself unable to drive the Danes fully back. The contest between them became more than a fight for a crown. It was the last stand of the old Anglo-Saxon kingship against the rising power of the North. Each man embodied a vision. Edmund, the heir of Alfred, carrying the hope of an England led by its native dynasty. Cnut, the son of Swine, carrying the vision of a North Sea realm that would bind England to Scandinavia. In late 1016, after months of strife, exhaustion forced a settlement. England was divided between them, Edmund keeping Wessex in the south, Cnut holding the north and the east. It might have been the beginning of a dual kingdom, but fate intervened once again. Edmund died suddenly within weeks, leaving Cnut as the undisputed ruler of all England. Thus, the young prince who had once been driven from the island now returned not as an exile, but as king. In less than 3 years, Cnut had turned loss into victory, exile into sovereignty. His rise was the turning of an age, the end of Wessex dominance and the birth of a Danish kingship that would reshape the island's destiny. With Edmund gone and the struggle decided, all that remained was for Cnut to claim his crown in London. The winter of 1017 dawned upon a changed England. For months the kingdom had been shaken by war, its future hanging in the balance between two rival heirs. Now, with Edmund Ironside gone and Cnut triumphant, all eyes turned to London, the beating heart of the realm, where the rituals of kingship would determine whether this young Dane could truly claim the crown of Alfred and Ethelstan. The coronation was no simple ceremony of triumph. It was a test of legitimacy, a declaration that this foreign prince was not merely a conqueror, but a king in the line of English tradition. The city, accustomed to the rhythms of trade and worship, now hummed with anticipation. Nobles, bishops, and common folk crowded its streets, watching as processions wound their way toward the great church, where the rite would unfold. Inside, the air was thick with incense and the echoes of chant. The coronation liturgy, centuries old, was a reminder that the English crown was sanctified not only by sword, but by sacred order. Bishops, vested in rich robes, stood ready to anoint the king with holy oil, a gesture that placed him beneath the blessing of God. The symbolism was unmistakable. This was no longer a Viking raider standing before them, but a monarch who sought to wear the crown as the English kings had worn it before. Cnut bowed to the traditions of the realm. Though his lineage reached back to the halls of Denmark, he chose to be crowned with the regalia of the Anglo-Saxons. The crown placed upon his head was not forged in the forges of the north, but preserved from the heritage of Wessex. The oath he swore was the oath of an English king, to protect the church, to uphold justice, and to defend his people. In that moment, the spectacle of legitimacy was complete. Yet beneath the solemnity lay a tension that could not be ignored. Many of the nobles who bent the knee that day had once fought against him, or against his father, or against the countless fleets that had ravaged their coasts. Their loyalty was born not of choice, but of necessity. Still, the coronation gave them a frame through which to accept the inevitable. The ritual told them that this was no longer an age of occupation. It was kingship, lawful and ordained. For Cnut himself, the coronation was more than a claim. It was a performance of unity. He knew that his rule depended not merely on the loyalty of his warriors, but on the acceptance of the English church and nobility. By donning the Anglo-Saxon crown, he signaled a willingness to govern in continuity rather than in rupture. He would be a Danish king, yes, but also the lawful successor to Edgar, Ethelred, and Edmund. It was a delicate balance, and Cnut understood its importance. The chroniclers recorded the moment with restraint, yet one can imagine the awe it must have stirred. A foreign king, youthful but composed, standing where the kings of Wessex had stood before him, now cloaked in the sanctity of anointing and the weight of English tradition. It was a sight that both unsettled and reassured, reminding the people that while the faces of rulers may change, the rituals of kingship endured. Beyond the church walls, the city of London embodied the paradox of this new reign. Merchants whispered in markets about what taxes might be levied, about the weight of Danegeld, about whether the peace would hold. Soldiers kept guard at the gates, their accents mingling Danish and English. For the common folk, the coronation was not an abstract symbol, but a question of daily survival. Would this new king bring stability, or would he drain the land as others had before him? Cnut's coronation was therefore both beginning and trial. It marked the formal entry of a foreign dynasty into the heart of England, but it also bound the young king to expectations he could not ignore. To rule merely as a conqueror would invite rebellion. To rule as an English king required wisdom, restraint, and the ability to bridge two worlds. In time, Cnut would prove adept at this balancing act. But in those first days of 1017, the coronation stood as a fragile promise, shimmering like the winter light on the Thames. A Danish prince had taken an English crown, not by his sword alone, but by a ritual that transformed conquest into sovereignty. The age of Cnut had begun, not with the roar of battle, but with the solemn chant of priests, the weight of an ancient crown, and the uneasy hope of a kingdom weary of strife. It was here, in the heart of London, that the future of England under a Danish king truly began to take shape. But a crown alone could not guarantee safety, and Cnut knew his first task was to deal with those who still defied him. In the months that followed his coronation, Cnut understood that a crown, once placed upon the head, was not secure until the kingdom itself was made safe. The anointing had given him the blessing of the church and the rituals of kingship, but there still lingered in the shadows the loyalties of men who had once fought for Edmund Ironside. These lords, bound by blood and by oath to the fallen heir of Wessex, could not be ignored. To leave them unchallenged was to invite plots, rebellions, and the constant fear that the old dynasty might rise again. Cnut's task was clear. He had to transform conquest into stability, and stability required the elimination of threats. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was a proud and fractious class. Some had already bent to his rule, seeking peace and favor in exchange for their obedience. Others still nurtured quiet hopes that the sons of Edmund might one day reclaim their father's crown. Cnut acted decisively. He sent messages to the great lords of England demanding their fealty, not as a request, but as a command. Those who complied were welcomed into the new order. Those who hesitated were removed, their power stripped away, their voices silenced in the councils of the realm. Among the most notorious figures of this unsettled age was Edric Strona, the ealdorman of Mercia. His name, Strona, meaning the Acquisitor, captured his reputation for opportunism and cunning. Edric had been a master of shifting allegiance, a man who had betrayed Ethelred, bargained with Edmund, and even shifted sides on the battlefield when the outcome hung in doubt. To many in England, he embodied the corruption and instability that had plagued the kingdom in its darkest years. He had survived through guile, making himself indispensable while never truly loyal to any cause but his own. Cnut, however, was not a man to tolerate such duplicity. To build his rule, he needed loyalty that was unshaken, not the wavering allegiance of men who traded crowns as though they were coins. At first, Edric sought favor with the new king, boasting of the role he had played in bringing about Edmund's defeat. But Cnut saw in him not an ally, but a liability. The very qualities that had allowed Edric to survive under Ethelred and Edmund made him too dangerous to keep under his own reign. In one of his first decisive acts as king, Cnut moved to rid himself of this peril. Edric was seized and executed, a judgment as swift as it was symbolic. The message was unmistakable. Betrayal might serve in an age of weakness, but under Cnut, duplicity would not be rewarded. With Edric's death, the most infamous turncoat of Anglo-Saxon England was gone, and the throne was rid of a man whose name had become a byword for treachery. But Cnut's purge did not stop there. Across the kingdom, he sought out those whose allegiance lay too firmly with the old dynasty. Some were quietly stripped of their lands, replaced by men more favorable to Danish rule. Others were drawn into exile, their influence removed from English soil, and in each case the pattern was clear. Cnut was not content to rest on the loyalty of chance. He demanded certainty, a kingdom reshaped to his command. This process, harsh though it seemed, was also strategic. By removing those most likely to rebel, Cnut not only protected his throne, but also won over those who feared instability. For the common people, weary after years of strife, the sight of decisive action may have brought a measure of relief. They did not wish to see the realm torn again by divided loyalties. In Cnut's ruthlessness, there was also a promise that England would no longer be a land where men like Edric could thrive. The chronicles record these events with a mix of condemnation and approval. To some, Cnut was the foreigner who ruled with an iron hand, cutting down rivals without hesitation. To others, he was the restorer of order, ending the intrigues and treachery that had made England so vulnerable. What is certain is that by the end of his first year as king, Cnut had secured his position not only through ceremony, but through decisive action. The elimination of rivals marked a turning point in his reign. With the old threats subdued, the new king could turn his gaze toward building rather than merely surviving. Yet the shadow of Edmund's line still lingered, and the memory of the Wessex dynasty remained strong in English hearts. Cnut would have to do more than remove enemies. He would have to weave himself into the very fabric of England's monarchy. For now, though, with Edric gone and the most dangerous lords subdued, Cnut had achieved what Ethelred never could: the silencing of treachery at the heart of the realm. The throne that once wavered beneath the weight of divided loyalties stood firm under the hand of its new master. And in this firm beginning, Cnut laid the foundations of a kingship that would seek not just to hold power, but to redefine it. With his rivals silenced, Cnut now turned from the sword to the bonds of marriage to secure his crown. After the throne had been secured and rivals cast aside, Cnut turned to a challenge no less critical than war: legitimacy. To hold England by force was one thing. To be accepted as its rightful sovereign was another. Kingship in this age rested not only upon victory in battle, but upon the careful weaving of alliances, dynasties, and sacred vows. Cnut, though still young, grasped this truth with clarity. He knew that to be more than a conqueror, he must bind his rule into the lineage of England itself. The opportunity came through a woman whose life was already deeply entwined with the fate of the English crown: Emma of Normandy. She was the daughter of Duke Richard I of Normandy and, more importantly, the widow of King Ethelred. During her years as queen, she had walked the halls of Winchester and Canterbury, had seen the kingdom at its weakest, and had borne children who carried both Anglo-Saxon and Norman blood. When Ethelred died in exile, Emma's position became uncertain, yet her importance remained undeniable. She embodied a bridge between England and Normandy, a duchy that stood as both ally and potential rival across the narrow sea. Cnut's decision to marry Emma was more than personal, it was profoundly political. By taking the widow of Ethelred as his queen, he bound himself to the old dynasty rather than standing entirely apart from it. The act sent a message to nobles and clerics alike. The new king did not rule as a foreign usurper, but as a successor who had joined himself to the very bloodline of those who came before. Emma's crown, once worn as wife of Ethelred, now graced the head of a Danish conqueror, transforming what had been a conquest into a continuation. For Emma, too, the marriage was a negotiation of survival and influence. By aligning herself with Cnut, she ensured her place in the new order and secured protection for her children. Yet she was no passive figure. Chroniclers portray her as proud and politically astute, a woman who wielded power not through the sword, but through presence, counsel, and alliance. As queen beside Cnut, she would later emerge as one of the most influential women of her century. The union carried meaning beyond England's shores. Normandy, already a rising power, had long-standing ties with both Scandinavia and England. By wedding Emma, Cnut signaled peace with the Norman dukes, securing his southern flank and ensuring that no hostile fleet would be launched from across the Channel. The marriage was thus a diplomatic act as much as a domestic one, turning a potential adversary into a partner and broadening the reach of Cnut's realm. The ceremony itself would have been steeped in solemnity, conducted under the watchful eyes of churchmen who saw in this union both opportunity and reassurance. A foreign king marrying an English queen within the sacred walls of a Christian church created a powerful image. It told the people that Cnut was not only their ruler by the sword's verdict, but also by the church's blessing and the lineage of England's own royalty. In the years to come, the marriage would yield children who further bound the dynasties of England, Denmark, and Normandy together. Among them was Cnut, who would inherit the throne after his father, and whose very name carried the fusion of Danish and English traditions. Through Emma, Cnut's reign was written not as a brief interruption in the history of the English monarchy, but as a chapter within it. The significance of this union cannot be overstated. It marked the moment when Cnut shifted from warrior to statesman, from conqueror to king in the fullest sense. His marriage to Emma legitimized his authority in the eyes of those who still mourned Edmund and Ethelred. It reassured the church that their new monarch was bound to Christian duty, and it signaled to Europe that England was now part of a greater network of dynastic power, stretching from the fjords of Denmark to the courts of Normandy. Thus, through one alliance, Cnut accomplished what years of fighting alone could not. He secured his throne not only with iron and fear, but with tradition, faith, and family. The image of the young king and the widowed queen, side by side, captured the essence of his vision, a kingdom forged from the clash of peoples, yet bound together by the continuity of its crown. And so the Danish conqueror became more than a foreign ruler. He became the lawful husband of England's queen, the inheritor of its royal line, and the architect of a dynasty that would shape the destiny of both England and Scandinavia. In this union of power and necessity, the reign of Cnut the Great found its true anchor. Yet even with a queen at his side, Cnut knew that true rule rested not only on alliance, but on power enforced by discipline and fear. Cnut's marriage to Emma had given his rule the sheen of legitimacy, yet legitimacy alone could not secure obedience. The memory of rebellion still haunted the land, and beneath the quiet surface of towns and villages lay uncertainty about what the new reign would bring. Cnut knew that kingship required more than alliances and ceremony. It required power that could be seen, felt, and feared. To govern England, he built his rule upon discipline and the constant presence of force. At the core of this new order stood his housecarls, a professional army unlike the temporary levies raised by Anglo-Saxon kings of the past. These warriors were not farmers pressed into battle for a season. They were men whose lives revolved around the sword, trained, equipped, and bound by personal loyalty to their king. They received steady pay, drawn from the resources of the realm, and their loyalty was sealed not by fleeting oaths, but by daily service. In them, Cnut found a bodyguard, a police force, and a standing reminder to every noble and commoner alike that the crown's authority was backed by strength. Where previous kings had relied on the shifting goodwill of local lords, Cnut relied on soldiers whose allegiance ran directly to him. Their presence in London and in key centers across the kingdom was a constant demonstration of discipline. Travelers passing through the capital would see the housecarls standing watch, tall and silent, clad in their armor, a visible embodiment of order. For the nobles, it was a warning. For the common folk, it was a reassurance that chaos might at last be held at bay. But such an army required resources, and resources meant taxation. Cnut did not abolish the Danegeld, the heavy levy once paid to buy off raiders. Instead, he transformed it from a desperate ransom into a regular system of revenue. What had once been the price of survival became the price of stability. Each village, each shire, was assessed and compelled to contribute, not to appease an enemy, but to maintain the king's peace. The Danegeld under Cnut was exacting, and it fell upon shoulders already wearied by decades of conflict. In towns and villages, one could imagine the rhythm of daily life interrupted by the demands of the collectors. Farmers counting out coins with rough hands, elders negotiating with stewards, children watching as silver was carried away. The burden was heavy, and many must have felt the sting of loss. Yet, alongside the weight of taxation came the uneasy realization that it worked. Roads were safer, markets more predictable, and for the first time in years, the terror of sudden raids diminished. The chronicles do not dwell on these scenes, but the imagination fills the silence. Picture the people of a small hamlet gathered before the reeve, their offerings of silver and livestock laid out on the table, eyes downcast. Some gaze upon the soldiers standing nearby with resentment, others with resignation, and a few, perhaps, with relief. Fear mingles with acceptance, for they know that this is the price of a king who can command both peace and power. To Cnut, this discipline was not cruelty, but necessity. He had inherited a fractured kingdom and turned it into the core of an empire. That required structure, predictability, and above all, obedience. Fear played its part, for fear was a language understood by nobles and peasants alike. But alongside fear was the promise of order. Unlike the days of Ethelred, when Danegeld bought nothing but further raids, under Cnut, it funded an army that defended rather than extorted. This balance of fear and security defined his early reign. The nobles who had once wavered learned that disloyalty could cost them dearly, while loyalty might earn favor. The church, supported by royal gifts, found a patron who upheld its authority, and the common people, though burdened, saw fields tilled without interruption and markets that bustled with trade. The price of peace was high, but peace nonetheless returned. Cnut's England thus became a realm shaped by discipline. The housecarls marched as symbols of unity, the tax collectors traveled as agents of necessity, and the people lived in a state of watchful obedience. It was not the freedom they might have wished for, but it was the stability they had long lacked. Through this mixture of fear and order, Cnut carved a place for himself not only as conqueror, but as governor. The image endures, villages surrendering their dues, soldiers standing silent with hands on their weapons, and a king who from his throne knew that the weight of silver and the discipline of arms were the pillars upon which his authority rested. Cnut had transformed the old cycle of chaos into a system of rule, and though his methods were stern, they gave to England what it hadn't known in many years, a measure of peace under a master both foreign and unyielding. Yet Cnut knew that fear alone could not sustain a crown. To endure, his rule had to draw the English nobility into its fold. Though Cnut ruled as a foreign conqueror, he understood that no kingdom could endure on fear and tribute alone. To govern England with lasting strength, he would need more than the loyalty of his Danish housecarls or the silver drawn from weary peasants. He needed the cooperation of the Anglo-Saxon elite, the great lords whose families had long shaped the kingdom's politics, whose authority in their shires could not simply be erased by decree. Where other conquerors might have sought to replace, Cnut chose instead to integrate. The court of the new king was therefore not solely a gathering of Danes from across the North Sea. It became a place where the nobility of England, men who had once fought against him, were drawn into the orbit of his rule. Cnut invited these lords into his councils, granting them titles, lands, and influence, provided they swore their loyalty. By such measures, he turned enemies into partners, or at least into dependents whose fortunes were tied to his own. The strategy was subtle but effective. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy did not vanish under Cnut, but rather was absorbed into a broader tapestry of power. Among these figures were the ealdormen, the powerful regional governors who commanded respect in their territories. They had been the backbone of English politics for generations, mediating between the crown and the localities. Cnut recognized their value, Instead of stripping them all of power, he sought to bind them more closely to his reign. Those who demonstrated fidelity were rewarded, their positions confirmed, sometimes even expanded. In turn, their local authority ensured that the king's will reached into every corner of the realm. The image of the court during these years is one of complexity. In the great halls of Winchester and London, Danish warriors stood guard while Anglo-Saxon nobles debated law and policy. Priests chanted prayers in Latin, scribes recorded decrees in Old English, and the king himself presided over it all, a foreign ruler who nevertheless spoke the language of English kingship. The mingling of cultures was not without tension, yet it created a foundation upon which stability could rest. For the common people, these arrangements mattered more than they might realize. When their local ealdorman or reeve enforced a royal command, it carried not only the authority of Cnut, but also the familiarity of a lord they had long known. In this way, the foreign king's rule was softened, translated through the structures of governance that had existed before him. It was a rule that looked Danish at the top, but felt English in the villages. This policy of integration also served a broader purpose. Cnut was no longer only king of England. His ambitions stretched across the North Sea, toward Denmark, and beyond. To govern such an empire, he could not afford constant rebellion in his English lands. By weaving Anglo-Saxon nobles into his administration, he created a sense of continuity. They had a stake in his success, and by binding their futures to his, he reduced the temptation of revolt. Chroniclers noted how the king, though stern, often sought counsel from both English and Danish advisors. He issued laws that echoed the traditions of Alfred and Edgar, signaling that his rule was not a rupture, but a continuation. This was not mere theater. It reflected a calculated choice. The legitimacy he had gained through Emma, through the church, and through conquest would be incomplete without the partnership of England's native elite. And so, in the years after his coronation, Cnut's court became a hybrid realm. The clang of Danish axes mixed with the wisdom of English law. The oaths of new warriors stood alongside the customs of old families. In this blend of traditions, Cnut forged a government both foreign and familiar, stern yet recognizable. The integration of the Anglo-Saxon nobility was not only a political tactic, but also a recognition of reality. A kingdom as vast and complex as England could not be ruled by outsiders alone. By granting authority to loyal ealdormen and including native nobles in his councils, Cnut ensured that his reign rested not just on conquest, but on consent. In that balance lay the durability of his kingship. Thus, the Danish king, who had taken England by storm, settled into the role of monarch by weaving his rule together with the threads of the very society he had conquered. It was not fear alone that held England in his grasp, but the careful mingling of power, loyalty, and tradition. And in that careful balance, the foundations of his empire began to solidify. But once England was secured, Cnut's gaze turned outward, across the waters that promised an empire. By the time Cnut had secured his throne in England, his ambitions had already begun to stretch beyond its shores. The kingdom was stable, the nobles subdued, and the church firmly in his favor. But Cnut was not content to be king of one land alone. The North Sea, long a highway of raiders and traders, now beckoned as the stage for a greater vision. He imagined not a realm bound by the borders of England, but an empire that spanned the waters, linking the kingdoms of the north under a single crown. His first opportunity came in 1019, when the throne of Denmark, left in uncertainty after his brother Harold's death, fell open. Cnut crossed the sea, returning to the land of his birth not as a claimant, but as a ruler with the full might of England behind him. The Danes, who had once seen him as a young exile, now recognized in him the strength of a monarch whose power stretched across two realms. By taking Denmark, Cnut secured the foundation of his dominion. He was no longer merely the conqueror of England, but the heir of his father's legacy, master of the Danish homeland. But the vision did not stop there. The coastlines of Norway, long a source of rivalry and unrest, called to him as well. Norway had its own proud traditions, its own jarls and kings, yet it was fractured and vulnerable. In 1028, Cnut pressed his claim, sailing with a fleet that carried the weight of two kingdoms. The Norwegian chieftains, faced with his overwhelming presence, bent to his will. Some chroniclers suggest that resistance was limited not by lack of courage, but by the sheer inevitability of his rise. Norway, too, was folded into his growing dominion. And so, within little more than a decade of taking the English crown, Cnut had forged something unprecedented, the so-called North Sea Empire. It was not an empire in the Roman sense, with armies stretching deep into distant lands. It was an empire of waters, its strength resting upon the seas that tied together England, Denmark, and Norway. The North Sea, once a barrier dividing peoples, now became the center of a kingdom that spanned 3 nations. The implications were immense. For the first time, England was not a beleaguered island fending off raiders, but a central pillar of a northern dominion. The wealth of England's fields and markets now supported a network of power that reached across the waves. Denmark provided the ancestral heart, Norway the strategic coastlines, and England the resources and prestige of a Christian kingdom with deep traditions of governance. To contemporaries, the scale of this achievement must have seemed astonishing. The Danes had once raided Lindisfarne. Now their king ruled from Winchester. The Norwegians had once contested the seas. Now their fate was bound to a monarch whose court blended Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norse traditions. This was more than conquest. It was transformation. The Viking Age, born in raids upon foreign shores, had culminated in a sovereign who united the very lands from which those raids had come. Yet the North Sea Empire was not without fragility. Its strength lay in Cnut's person, in his ability to command loyalty across languages and customs. Maintaining unity across such distances required diplomacy as much as force. But for the moment, under his rule, the empire stood whole. His dominion stretched from the chalk cliffs of Dover to the fjords of Norway, from the halls of Winchester to the harbors of Roskilde. Cnut now styled himself not only King of England, but also King of Denmark and of Norway, a title that echoed across Europe, elevating him among the most powerful rulers of Christendom. He corresponded with emperors and popes as an equal, not a petitioner. His realm, built upon ships and seas, was proof that power could flow as easily across the waters as it did across the land. This was the high tide of Cnut's reign, the moment when the currents of history seemed to carry him inexorably forward. What had begun with a crown won in England had become a dominion that bound together the northern world. It was a vision as grand as it was precarious. A North Sea empire, shimmering in its scale, destined to endure only so long as its master could hold it. Yet even as his empire rose across the northern seas, Cnut knew that true greatness required recognition on the continent. While Cnut's empire stretched across the waters of the North Sea, his ambitions carried him further still, to the courts and councils of continental Europe. He understood that power was not measured only in armies and silver, but also in recognition. A king who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway could claim mastery of the North, yet without acceptance from Christendom's highest authorities, his position remained incomplete. It was here that Cnut turned to diplomacy, weaving ties with the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and the royal houses of Europe. Relations with the Holy Roman Empire were of particular importance. The empire under Conrad II was the great continental power of the age, and its influence reached from the Rhine to the Alps. Cnut knew that peace and cooperation with such a neighbor were essential to secure Denmark's southern frontier. To achieve this, he arranged marriages that tied his dynasty to imperial blood. His daughter Gunhild was married to Conrad's son, the future Henry III, uniting the line of the North Sea Empire with that of the Holy Roman Emperors. This alliance gave Cnut prestige abroad and reinforced his image at home as a ruler whose influence extended beyond the seas. Marriage was not his only tool. Cnut also deployed gifts and correspondence, ensuring that his name carried weight in the courts of Europe. He sent envoys to Rome, bearing treasures and pledges of loyalty. His offerings to the papacy were not mere tribute, but gestures of piety, intended to show that the North Sea Empire was not a pagan remnant of the Viking Age, but a Christian realm led by a devout king. For a ruler whose forefathers had once raided monasteries, such gestures were powerful symbols of transformation. The journey he made to Rome in 1027 was a moment of particular significance. There, amidst the throngs who gathered for the coronation of Conrad II as emperor, Cnut appeared not as an outsider, but as a peer among rulers. Chroniclers record that he secured privileges for English and Danish pilgrims traveling to the Eternal City, protections for merchants, and recognition of his status from the Pope himself. To stand in Rome, the very heart of Christendom, and to receive honors was to confirm that his reign was not merely strong, but sanctified. These diplomatic efforts had a clear purpose. They strengthened his authority across his diverse realms by showing that he was not only tolerated, but respected by the greatest powers of the age. For his subjects in England, many of whom still looked with suspicion on a foreign king, the sight of their ruler, honored by the Pope and allied with the empire, provided reassurance. It told them that their king was no barbarian interloper, but a Christian monarch whose power was recognized from the fjords of Scandinavia to the palaces of Rome. Through marriage, gifts, and diplomacy, Cnut reshaped the image of the Viking world. No longer was it defined solely by long ships and raids. Under his hand, it became a partner in the order of Christian Europe. The Danes, who had once stood apart, now stood within, their king kneeling before the altar in Rome and standing beside emperors as an equal. Yet diplomacy was also a weapon. By forging ties with the empire and the papacy, Cnut shielded his dominion from interference. Rivals in Scandinavia or among the exiled heirs of Wessex found fewer allies when Europe's greatest rulers were bound to Cnut by oath and marriage. His empire was not only a creation of force, but of recognition, woven into the fabric of the continent's politics as securely as into the seas that bore his fleets. Thus, in the great halls of Winchester, in the courts of Denmark, and along the harbors of Norway, Cnut's authority rested on more than his armies. It was upheld by the blessings of Rome, the bonds of marriage, and the respect of emperors. His reign was proof that the age of the Vikings had yielded to a new order, one in which power flowed not only from the clash of arms, but from the subtle art of diplomacy. The Danish conqueror of England had become a statesman of Europe, his empire stretching across waters but anchored in the recognition of Christendom. It was this blend of conquest and diplomacy, of sword and sacrament, that allowed Cnut's North Sea empire to shine so brightly in its brief but brilliant existence. And as diplomacy strengthened his empire abroad, faith became the force that bound it within. Cnut's empire, vast and improbable, was held together not only by ships, silver, and armies, but also by faith. He understood that to rule in Christendom, one must appear not only as a strong monarch, but as a devout one. His forefathers had been pagans, feared as destroyers of churches and slayers of monks, but Cnut sought to fashion a new image, that of the Viking, who had become not merely a Christian king, but a Christian emperor of Europe's north. He did this, first, through patronage. Across England and Denmark, and later in Norway, Cnut directed wealth toward the church. Monasteries, once sacked by Viking raiders, were now rebuilt under his command. Churches were granted lands, revenues, and privileges, binding their prosperity to the favor of the crown. Where the Viking age had been marked by desecration, his reign was marked by restoration. For every noble who might doubt his loyalty to England, there was a bishop who could point to the king's generosity as proof of his piety. At Winchester, one of the great centers of Anglo-Saxon Christianity, Cnut and Queen Emma endowed churches and shrines, raising altars where prayers were offered not only for the king's soul, but for the stability of the realm. Pilgrims who traveled through his lands found protections and privileges guaranteed by royal decree. He sent rich gifts to Canterbury, to Ely, to Bury St. Edmunds, and to the ancient seas that had been the spiritual heart of the English people. The message was unmistakable. This was no foreign despot ruling by fear, but a Christian monarch, ensuring that faith and order went hand in hand. Even more striking was Cnut's willingness to use religion as a tool of propaganda. He ordered laws and charters to be written not only in Latin, but in Old English, embedding Christian justice in the language of his subjects. His proclamations invoked God's authority, declaring that he ruled by the grace of Almighty God, a formula that aligned him with the traditions of Charlemagne and the Carolingian emperors. In the age of chronicles and sermons, such words mattered. They told monks with their quills, priests in their pulpits, and nobles in their halls that Cnut was not a Viking warlord, but a king chosen and sanctified. His pilgrimage to Rome in 1027 amplified this image. There, at the heart of Christendom, he prayed at the shrines of saints, offered gifts to the Pope, and returned with privileges for his subjects. When word of these acts reached England, they carried immense symbolic weight. A king who walked the streets of Rome, who knelt before the altar of St. Peter, was no longer a stranger from the sea, but a sovereign in communion with the universal church. It was a narrative carefully cultivated, and it worked. The transformation was powerful in its contrast. Only 2 centuries earlier, Viking longships had spread terror along the coasts of England and Francia, burning monasteries and scattering relics. Now the descendant of those raiders was building the very houses of worship once destroyed, endowing the monks whose predecessors had chronicled the devastation. To contemporaries, the symbolism could not have been clearer. The age of destruction had given way to an age of order, the age of pagan kings to the reign of a Christian emperor. For Cnut, this image was more than a matter of prestige. It was the glue that bound his empire together. Denmark, Norway, and England were not unified by blood or language, but they could be unified by faith. By presenting himself as the protector of the church, Cnut offered his subjects a common frame of identity that transcended tribal divisions. Whether Saxon, Dane, or Norse, all could see in him a ruler whose authority flowed from the same divine source. In this way, Cnut's reign became a turning point in the story of the North. The Vikings, once outsiders in the Christian world, had been absorbed into its order, and Cnut himself stood as the living symbol of that change. His donations, his pilgrimages, his laws, and his titles all proclaimed the same message. The Dane who had conquered England was now the Christian monarch of a northern empire, no longer feared as a raider, but revered as a king sanctified by God. The image endures, a powerful piece of medieval propaganda. Cnut, the Viking who became a Christian king of Europe, bridging 2 worlds, and in doing so, reshaping both. It was through the cross as much as the sword that he bound his dominion, and through faith as much as force that he secured his legacy. And with faith securing his image, Cnut now stood ready to wield that authority at the height of his power. By the late 1020s, Cnut the Great stood at the height of his power. Few rulers in Europe could match the breadth of his dominion, and fewer still could equal the balance of fear, faith, and diplomacy upon which it rested. From the fjords of Norway to the cathedrals of England, his name carried both awe and authority. For a man whose father had once come to England as a raider, the transformation was nothing short of extraordinary. In England, he was no longer seen merely as the foreign conqueror who had taken the crown from Edmund Ironside. Through law-giving, patronage of the church, and the integration of Anglo-Saxon nobles into his court, he had woven himself into the fabric of English kingship. At royal assemblies, charters were issued in his name, with the solemn phrases once reserved for Alfred, Edgar, and Ethelred. Bishops praised him as a protector of the faith, while merchants enjoyed the relative peace that his armies and taxes ensured. In Denmark, he was hailed as the heir of Sweyn Forkbeard, a king who had secured not only the homeland, but also bound it to the wealth of England. The revenues of 2 realms sustained his housecarls and fleets, making Denmark more secure than at any time in memory. The Danish aristocracy, who might once have contested his authority, had little choice but to recognize that under Cnut, their land had become a central pillar of a great northern empire. In Norway, his grip was newer and less secure, yet even there, the weight of his authority was felt. The chieftains who had sworn to him in 1028 did so not merely because of force, but because they saw in him a ruler whose reach extended beyond their narrow fjords. Cnut offered them not just conquest, but inclusion in a greater order, an empire that could defend them from rivals and bring them into the wider networks of Christendom. On the continent, Cnut's stature was equally impressive. His pilgrimage to Rome had shown the princes of Europe that he was no outsider, but a monarch who walked confidently in the company of emperors. His gifts to the papacy, his alliances with the Holy Roman Empire, and his correspondence with the rulers of France and Flanders all served to project an image of a ruler whose authority reached across land and sea. Where once the North had been seen as a source of pirates and instability, now it was bound to Europe by the hand of a Christian king. The chroniclers of the time speak of him in tones of reverence. In England, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, though often wary of foreign rulers, recorded his reign with a measure of respect. At Ely, monks composed verses celebrating his generosity and piety. Even in later centuries, when memory of his empire had faded, Cnut remained a figure of fascination, a Viking who had become a king among Christian monarchs. Yet this power was not limitless, nor was it invulnerable. The North Sea Empire was a creation of Cnut's genius and authority, but it rested heavily on his person. The lands he ruled were diverse in language, law, and custom. England's shires, Denmark's jarldoms, and Norway's fjord communities were not bound together by deep institutions, but by the will of one man. For as long as he lived, his charisma and discipline held them fast, but already careful observers could see the fragility that lay beneath the grandeur. For the moment, however, those cracks were hidden beneath the brilliance of his reign. At Winchester, he presided over councils with English bishops and nobles at his side. At Roskilde, he stood as the heir of Denmark, commanding loyalty and tribute. At Trondheim, he claimed authority as King of Norway. His seal, impressed on charters, bore not just one title but three: King of all England and Denmark, and the Norwegians, and of some of the Swedes. Few rulers in Europe could boast such an array of crowns. The image of Cnut at his zenith is one of majesty tempered by calculation. He was not reckless, nor did he allow victory to blind him to the necessity of diplomacy. He balanced the sword with the cross, conquest with patronage, fear with order. His rule was both stern and sophisticated, a mixture of northern strength and Christian kingship that placed him among the most powerful monarchs of his age. This was the high tide of Cnut's greatness. The seas that had once borne raiders now bore his fleets of kingship. The lands that had once feared the Viking now bowed to the Christian monarch. His empire, shimmering across the waters of the north, stood as both triumph and paradox, immense in scale, yet fragile in its foundations, magnificent in appearance, yet resting on the life and will of a single man. And so, in the late 1020s and early 1030s, Europe beheld a sight unseen before: a Viking who had become not only the ruler of England, but the architect of a northern empire, a king whose authority stretched across seas, sanctified by Rome and feared by all who dwelt within the reach of the tides. But even at the height of his power, Cnut knew that true kingship was tested not only on the battlefield, but in the laws that shaped daily life. When Cnut reached the height of his authority, he faced a challenge that could not be solved by conquest alone. Armies might hold a throne, and diplomacy might win recognition, but the true test of a king lay in the laws that shaped the daily lives of his people. England, with its deep traditions of Anglo-Saxon custom, could not be ruled by decree from a foreign conqueror forever. If his reign were to endure, Cnut had to weave the familiar patterns of English law with the authority of his new order. This he did with care and deliberation. Cnut's laws, preserved in charters and codes, reveal a ruler who sought not to erase but to harmonize. He drew upon the legal traditions of Alfred and Edgar, grounding his authority in continuity. At the same time, he brought with him the discipline and rigor of the Scandinavian world. The result was a body of law that felt both English and new, a framework that reassured his subjects while strengthening royal control. Central to these laws was the protection of property. After decades of instability and raids, the security of land and goods was a matter of deep concern. Cnut's proclamations emphasized that theft, unlawful seizure, and violence against property would not be tolerated. Those who broke the law would face penalties not only because they had wronged their neighbor, but because they had offended the peace of the king. In this way, every field, every cart, and every flock became part of the order secured by royal justice. Equally important was the preservation of social hierarchy. Anglo-Saxon society was structured with clear distinctions between king, noble, freeman, and serf. Cnut did not attempt to overturn this order. Instead, he reinforced it, making explicit that each person's duties and rights were to be honored. The laws recognized obligations upward and downward: lords to protect their dependents, dependents to serve their lords, all within the framework of a kingdom united under the crown. By doing so, Cnut ensured that his rule did not unsettle the familiar rhythms of English life, but rather embedded itself within them. Religion, too, stood at the heart of his legislation. Cnut's codes often read as moral proclamations, reminding his subjects that the peace of the realm was tied to the peace of the church. He commanded that Sundays and holy days be observed, that tithes be paid, and that the authority of bishops be respected. The sanctity of churches and monasteries was placed under the king's special protection. To offend against the church was not merely a sin, but a crime against the order of the realm. This was the natural extension of his image as a devout Christian monarch, the Viking king now cast as the guardian of Christendom within his lands. The voice that speaks from these laws is not only stern but measured. Cnut often framed his decrees as the will of both king and people, a conscious echo of the old Anglo-Saxon tradition of consensus in the Witan, the royal council. By presenting his laws as the product of consultation, he reassured his subjects that their traditions had not been swept away. Yet the underlying reality was clear. Royal authority had never been stronger. Every judgment, every penalty, every safeguard bore the mark of a king whose reach extended from the throne into every township and parish. The chronicles suggest that these laws had real effect. Merchants traveled with greater confidence, knowing that theft on the road would be punished. Farmers sowed their fields under the protection of a crown that claimed responsibility for their peace. Priests and monks, once fearful of raiders, now enjoyed royal charters that defended their lands and sanctuaries. For ordinary men and women, Cnut's laws meant that life could once again be predictable, measured not by the threat of chaos, but by the rhythm of justice. In this way, Cnut demonstrated that law was as potent a weapon as the sword. By harmonizing Anglo-Saxon custom with Scandinavian order, he created a system that was at once familiar and firm. His reign was not remembered only for battles and empires, but for the peace that flowed from his codes. Through his legislation, he bound his diverse subjects together, offering them the promise that under his rule, land, life, and faith were secure. Thus, the Viking conqueror became the lawgiver of England. His legacy in this realm was not of burning halls, but of written codes, not of destruction, but of order. And in this, perhaps more than in conquest, lay the true measure of his greatness. Yet the strength of a king was measured not only in laws and justice, but in the wealth that sustained his realm. Cnut's reign was not only about law and order, nor about armies and faith. It was also about wealth. Wealth that flowed across the seas, binding his empire together and transforming England into the beating heart of a North Sea economy. For centuries, the waters between Scandinavia and the British Isles had been the paths of raiders and outlaws. Under Cnut, they became highways of commerce, carrying ships laden not with plunder, but with goods that enriched king and subject alike. The North Sea was the lifeline of his dominion. From the ports of Denmark came timber, furs, and iron. From Norway flowed fish and resources from the rugged north. From England went wool, grain, and silver, products of a fertile land and bustling workshops. Cnut's empire turned these separate economies into a single network. Traders who once feared ambush now sailed with greater security, protected by the stability that his rule imposed. The very seas that had divided peoples became, under his watch, the arteries of a thriving commercial world. At the center of this network stood London. Already important in the Anglo-Saxon age, it now flourished as never before. The Thames bustled with ships from Denmark, Flanders, Normandy, and even farther afield. Markets swelled with goods. Silks from the south, spices from distant trade routes, amber from the Baltic, and the produce of English shires. Coins struck with Cnut's image circulated widely, a visible sign that commerce and kingship were inseparable. The city became not only the economic hub of his English realm, but a showcase of the prosperity that flowed from imperial unity. The merchants of London, once wary of constant disruption, now enjoyed privileges and protections enshrined in royal charters. Cnut understood that the loyalty of traders was bought not by force, but by prosperity. He guaranteed safe passage for those who came to his ports, extended protections to foreign merchants, and encouraged the growth of markets that tied England to the continent. In doing so, he transformed London from a city on the margins of Europe into one of its essential crossroads. But commerce was not confined to the capital. Across the shires, towns began to grow, their fortunes tied to the stability of the age. Markets in York, Lincoln, and Norwich echoed with the chatter of traders. Inland routes carried goods from field to port, while coastal villages that had once feared Viking sails now benefited from the steady rhythm of trade. The wealth of England, its wool, its grain, its livestock, became the currency of a larger world. This prosperity served more than the traders. It sustained the king's government, funded the armies that enforced peace, and underpinned the church that sanctified his reign. Silver collected in taxes was not hoarded in Winchester or Roskill. It circulated through the economy, returning as wages for soldiers, as gifts to abbeys, and as payments to merchants. The effect was cumulative. Peace enabled trade, trade enriched the kingdom, and wealth strengthened the hand of the crown. The chroniclers, often silent on matters of economy, nevertheless hint at the transformation. They describe the peace of Cnut's reign, the flow of silver, the generosity shown to the church. Behind these words lies the reality of a kingdom humming with activity, a society where trade was no longer disrupted by the fear of sudden violence. For ordinary people, prosperity was seen not in tall ships or royal charters, but in fuller markets, safer roads, and the sense that their toil might yield more than mere survival. In this way, the Viking conqueror became the architect of an economic order. By securing the seas and binding England into a larger commercial world, Cnut reshaped not only politics but daily life. The man whose ancestors had once plundered monasteries now presided over an empire where markets thrived under his protection. The irony was striking, but the achievement was undeniable. Thus, Cnut's greatness was measured not only by crowns and battles, but by the hum of trade on the Thames, the clink of coins bearing his name, and the quiet growth of towns across the land. In turning the North Sea into a realm of commerce, he gave England and his empire a legacy of prosperity that endured long after the sails of his fleets had vanished from the horizon. Yet prosperity alone could not define his reign, for its true measure lay in how the people themselves remembered him. For all the wealth of kingship, the weight of law, and the grandeur of empire, the true measure of a reign lies in the eyes of the people who lived beneath it. How, then, did the Anglo-Saxons, those who had endured invasion, seen dynasties topple, and now lived under a foreign-born monarch, regard Cnut the Great? The answer is complex, shaded by loyalty and resentment, reverence and unease, all of it captured in fragments of song, chronicle, and memory. To many, Cnut was first and foremost a conqueror. The memory of war in 1016, when Edmund Ironside fought to defend the line of Wessex, was still fresh. For older generations, Cnut was the man who had ended their native dynasty, the foreigner who wore the crown once graced by Alfred the Great and Edgar the Peaceful. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in the tongue of their ancestors, rarely forgot to remind readers that this was a Danish king, one who had come by force and whose reign was unlike those before. Its tone, often clipped and cautious, reflected the unease of chroniclers who struggled to reconcile national pride with foreign rule. Yet memory has many layers. Alongside resentment came recognition. The chronicle, though wary, also recorded the peace of Cnut's reign, the absence of raids, the steady rhythm of law. For ordinary villagers who once feared the sudden arrival of longships, this peace was no small blessing. Markets grew, roads were safer, and the presence of a strong monarch, though foreign, allowed life to settle into rhythms long disrupted. To them, Cnut was not simply the Dane who had taken England, but the king who had restored stability to their lives. In popular tradition, the figure of Cnut took on even richer shades. Ballads and tales passed from village to village spoke of the Danish king with a mixture of awe and fascination. Some stories remembered his stern justice, others his acts of devotion to the church. Still others told the tale, half legend, half parable, of the king who placed his throne by the shore and commanded the tide to halt, a story that would endure for centuries as a symbol of humility and wisdom. Though later embroidered, the seed of that legend reflects how the people imagined their ruler, not only powerful but aware of the limits of power itself. Poetry of the monastic schools also played its part. At Ely, monks composed verses praising his generosity and the gifts he bestowed upon their abbey. To them, Cnut was a patron, a king who had turned the Viking impulse from destruction to protection. In their words, he was not the outsider, but the chosen ruler, sanctified by his faith and his support of holy places. The contrast was stark. To some, he was the foreigner who ruled them. To others, the Christian monarch who secured their future. What emerges from these voices is a portrait not of uniform praise or condemnation, but of negotiation. The Anglo-Saxons, pragmatic as ever, weighed their losses against their gains. They had lost the dynasty of Alfred, but they had gained a ruler who maintained law and defended the church. They had lost a native king, but they had gained a peace that allowed markets to thrive and faith to flourish. This duality is perhaps the truest measure of their view. Cnut was both outsider and sovereign, both reminder of conquest and guarantor of stability. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, ballads, and monastic poetry thus preserve more than facts. They preserve the mood of a nation adjusting to foreign rule. In them, we hear the echoes of hesitation, of cautious acceptance, and of admiration tempered by memory. For the common farmer, the merchant in London, the monk in Ely, the figure of Cnut meant different things, but for all, he was inescapably their king. And so, in the imagination of his subjects, the Viking who had come as an enemy became woven into the identity of England itself. Through stories, songs, and chronicles, the people of Anglo-Saxon England told and retold the paradox of his reign, that a foreign conqueror could become a Christian king, that fear could give way to stability, and that the memory of conquest could coexist with gratitude for peace. It is in their voices preserved across centuries that the legacy of Cnut truly lives. Yet beyond the voices of the people, another power shaped his reign, the church. The partnership between kingship and the church was never incidental in the Middle Ages. It was essential. For Cnut, who bore the double burden of being both a conqueror and a foreigner, this truth was doubly important. If law and order won him obedience, and commerce bought him loyalty, it was the church that could sanctify his rule, transforming a Danish king into a Christian monarch whose authority reached into the souls as well as the lives of his subjects. From the beginning of his reign, Cnut sought to bind the church to his throne. He endowed it with wealth, confirmed its privileges, and presented himself as its protector. Bishops were not only spiritual leaders but also pillars of administration, able to enforce the king's commands and carry his reputation into every shire and parish. In return, the church offered what no army could: legitimacy framed in the language of faith. To hear sermons declaring Cnut as the chosen of God was to make his rule not only lawful, but sacred. Canterbury stood at the heart of this relationship. As the seat of the archbishop, it was the spiritual center of England, the place where the church itself spoke with authority across the land. Cnut visited Canterbury and confirmed its rights, demonstrating publicly that he was no outsider to the faith. His gifts of land and treasure to the see of Canterbury were both political and devotional. They reminded the clergy that their welfare depended upon his favor, and they reminded the people that their king sought blessing from the holiest shrine in England. Yet, Canterbury was not alone. Cnut's generosity extended to other centers of devotion, most notably Ely and Winchester. Ely, long a site of monastic life, flourished under his patronage. The abbey received lands and charters, its monks recording their gratitude in verses that praised the king's piety. In their writings, Cnut was transformed from warrior to benefactor, from raider to guardian of holy places. These records endure as testaments not only to the king's wealth, but to the deliberate shaping of his image as a Christian ruler. Winchester, too, benefited from his attention. As one of the traditional capitals of the Anglo-Saxon realm, it carried immense symbolic weight. By favoring Winchester's church and monasteries, Cnut aligned himself with the memory of Alfred and the West Saxon kings, embedding his foreign rule into the line of England's sacred past. For pilgrims and clerics alike, the sight of a Danish king kneeling in the hallowed spaces of Winchester was proof that conquest had given way to continuity. The alliance with the church was more than patronage. It was a partnership of mutual necessity. The clergy required a strong king to defend their lands and protect their privileges, just as the king required the clergy to preach obedience and sanctify his decrees. Monks recorded charters, priests repeated his name in prayer, bishops stood at his side in council. The machinery of faith became inseparable from the machinery of government. This relationship also extended beyond England. Cnut's pilgrimage to Rome, his gifts to the papacy, and his ties to continental churches reinforced the idea that he was no mere northern warlord, but a Christian sovereign recognized across Europe. Every monastery he supported, every church he endowed, tied him more closely into the spiritual networks of Christendom. In this, his reign symbolized a turning point. The Viking age of raiding monasteries was over, replaced by a king who built them anew. For the people, these acts carried meaning beyond politics. To see churches rise, to hear bells ring in peace, to know that holy relics were guarded and honored. This was tangible proof that their king cared for the soul of the land. Faith gave Cnut's rule a moral weight that arms alone could not supply. In the sermons of priests and the chants of monks, his authority was lifted from earth to heaven. His power echoed in the language of salvation. Thus, through the church, Cnut secured more than obedience. He secured memory. Generations after his death, when the empire of the North Sea had dissolved, the records of Ely and Winchester still spoke of his generosity. Chronicles remembered him not only as the conqueror of England, but as the king who prayed, who gave, and who built. In their pages, the image of Cnut was preserved not as a foreign usurper, but as a Christian ruler, woven into the sacred story of the land he once ruled. And so, in cathedrals and cloisters, in stone walls and written words, the alliance of Cnut and the church gave lasting shape to his reign. It was here, perhaps more than on the battlefield or the sea, that his transformation was complete. The Viking king, crowned in England, reborn as a monarch sanctified by faith, whose legacy endured as both ruler and protector of Christendom's holy places. Yet faith was only one bond. In daily life, England itself was changing, becoming Anglo-Danish. By the time Cnut's reign reached maturity, England itself was no longer purely Anglo-Saxon, nor merely ruled by Danes. It had become something in between, a land shaped by conquest and accommodation, where cultures once divided by sea and sword now mingled in ways subtle and profound. Out of this mixture emerged a new identity, an Anglo-Danish kingdom in the heart of the 11th century. The marks of this fusion could be seen first in stone. Churches rose with forms that echoed both traditions. The enduring lines of Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship blended with the sturdier, heavier influences of the north. In the countryside, timber halls were built in styles familiar to Danes, yet adorned with English carvings. Architecture became a language of compromise, speaking to both past and present. It told villagers that the foreign king had brought not only his soldiers, but his artisans, and that together with English builders, they reshaped the very look of towns and monasteries. Language, too, bore the mark of blending. The Old English of Alfred and Ethelred absorbed words from the Norse tongue. Everyday speech in markets and courts began to reflect this mingling. Place names across the countryside, York, Grimsby, Whitby, stood as living reminders of Scandinavian settlement, while the English tongue itself carried traces of northern sounds. This linguistic exchange was not forced but natural, the product of daily interaction between peoples who shared fields, trade, and households. Customs likewise merged. Anglo-Saxon law had long provided order, but Norse practices of governance, like the thing, the assembly of free men, found echoes in English councils. Marriage between English and Danish families knitted bonds across cultural lines. In feasts and festivals, traditions intertwined. Songs that once praised Norse heroes now mingled with Christian hymns sung in English churches. Slowly, the line between foreigner and native blurred, replaced by a shared sense of belonging to a realm larger than either tradition alone. The church played a vital role in this process. It offered common ground, where Dane and Englishmen alike knelt before the same altar. Cnut himself embodied the synthesis, a Danish conqueror who ruled in the image of a Christian king, supporting monasteries and upholding laws written in Old English. His reign symbolized the possibility of unity, even if forged from the friction of conquest. For the people of the time, this new Anglo-Danish identity was not abstract. It was lived in daily life, in the tongue spoken at the market, in the coins stamped with a Danish king's face but bearing English inscriptions, in the churches rebuilt with a mixture of styles, in the feasts where both Norse sagas and English chronicles were remembered. It was the quiet forging of a New England, neither entirely Saxon nor entirely Danish, but something broader, more resilient. Thus, the reign of Cnut left behind not only peace and prosperity, but also a cultural legacy. The England of the 11th century became a crossroads of worlds, where Norse vigor and Anglo-Saxon tradition met and mingled. It was here, in the heart of his empire, that the Viking king's conquest transformed into something greater than rule, the birth of an Anglo-Danish realm, whose echoes would endure long after his empire itself had passed. Yet even as this new Anglo-Danish realm took shape, its future rested on the life of one man, and in 1035, that life came to an end. In the autumn of 1035, after nearly 2 decades upon the throne of England and with crowns gathered from across the North Sea, Cnut the Great's life reached its end. He had risen from the son of a Danish conqueror to become master of an empire, binding together England, Denmark, and Norway under one rule. Yet no man, however mighty, could conquer time itself. His death marked not only the passing of a king, but the unraveling of the delicate fabric he had so carefully woven. The chronicles tell of his final days at Shaftesbury, and of his body carried to Winchester, the old heart of West Saxon kingship. There, in the minster whose stones had borne witness to the prayers of Alfred and Edgar, Cnut was laid to rest. For some, his burial in England was the final sign of his transformation. The Viking who had once come as an enemy now lay among the kings of the English, claimed by the land he had conquered. Bells tolled, priests chanted, and for a moment the realm paused, suspended between mourning and uncertainty. That uncertainty was deep, for Cnut's strength had been singular. His empire rested not on enduring institutions, but on his personal authority, his careful balance of fear, faith, and diplomacy. With his passing, the question of succession opened like a wound. Who would now wear the crown of England, and how would the wider empire endure? The court was soon divided. On one side stood Harold Harefoot, Cnut's son by Elfgifu of Northampton, supported by a faction of English nobles who valued his presence in the land and his swift claim. On the other side was Harthacnut, Cnut's son by Queen Emma of Normandy, rightful heir not only in Denmark, but by his mother's alliance, linked to the powerful duchy across the Channel. Harthacnut, however, was in Denmark when his father died, unable to cross the sea at once to claim his inheritance. The split was more than a rivalry between two brothers. It was the fracture of the empire itself. Harold's supporters urged immediate rule, fearing that a kingdom without a king would descend into chaos. Emma and her allies resisted, insisting that only Harthacnut carried the full legitimacy of Cnut's line. The Witan, England's council of nobles and churchmen, became the stage of argument, its halls echoing with the uncertainty of the time. To the people, the death of Cnut was felt as both grief and foreboding. They remembered the peace of his reign, the order of his laws, the prosperity of his markets. Now, as rumors spread of quarrels within the royal house, they feared a return to the old days of instability. For England, the memory of long years of Viking invasions was still near, and the prospect of division at the top of power brought little comfort. The moment was heavy with symbolism. The man who had united crowns in life left behind crowns in contest at his death. The North Sea Empire, built with brilliance and held with strength, now stood upon shifting sands. The figure of Cnut, lawgiver, patron of the church, master of seas, was gone. In his place remained only the struggle of heirs, and the question of whether his empire could outlive the man who had created it. Thus the year 1035 closed with mourning and with doubt. Cnut lay in Winchester among the kings of old, his body at rest, but his legacy unsettled. England, Denmark, and Norway, once bound together by his will, now faced the future uncertain, caught between the memory of a great king and the rivalry of sons who could not yet match his strength. And with the king's passing, the empire he had forged began to crumble. The death of Cnut in 1035 was not only the end of a man, but the beginning of the end for his empire. What he had bound together by will, law, and faith now began to loosen thread by thread. England, Denmark, and Norway, once united under a single crown, were never truly fused by institutions strong enough to outlast the king who had created them. Without Cnut's guiding hand, the North Sea Empire, brilliant in its scope, began to dissolve. The first sign of fracture came in England. The struggle between Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut divided the court, with rival factions vying for control. Harold, present in the kingdom, seized the advantage, proclaiming himself regent and later king. Emma, widow of Cnut and mother of Harthacnut, resisted fiercely from her base at Winchester, but the absence of her son weakened her cause. England, which had once looked to the north for its sovereign, now became the battleground of competing heirs. Meanwhile, in Denmark, Harthacnut faced challenges of his own. He was recognized as king there, yet his position was far from secure. The demands of defending Denmark from threats abroad made it impossible for him to assert authority in England at once. The realm that Cnut had ruled with unity now demanded choices, and each choice cost him influence in another land. Norway was the first to break away entirely. The bonds that had tied it to Cnut's empire were never as firm as those in England or Denmark. In 1035, the exiled Prince Magnus, son of Olaf II, returned with the support of Norwegian nobles, eager to restore a native dynasty. Without Cnut's presence to enforce loyalty, the kingdom slipped from the grasp of his heirs. By 1036, Norway had effectively cast off Danish rule, marking the first clear fracture of the North Sea realm. England, too, resisted unity. Harold Harefoot, though securing the throne, did so without the full legitimacy his father had enjoyed. His reign was marked by suspicion and conflict with Emma and her supporters. Harthacnut, when finally able to sail from Denmark, inherited a divided kingdom. The dream of a seamless succession was shattered. Instead, England once again tasted the uncertainty of disputed kingship. The broader picture was one of fragmentation. What had been a northern empire, stretching from the shores of England to the fjords of Norway, was revealed to be less an enduring structure than the extension of a single man's authority. Cnut's genius had been to hold these lands together, balancing their rivalries and binding them with his prestige. But genius cannot be inherited. His sons lacked his strength, his vision, and his ability to command loyalty across cultures. For the people of the time, the collapse of the empire was swift and visible. Merchants who once traded freely across a united sea now faced new barriers. Nobles who had sworn allegiance to a single monarch now shifted their loyalty to rival kings. The peace and stability that had marked Cnut's reign gave way to the familiar tensions of divided rule. Thus, by the late 1030s, the North Sea Empire was no more. Norway stood independent under its native dynasty. Denmark clung to Harthacnut, while England wavered between Harold and Emma's line. The dream of a united northern realm had died with its creator, and yet, even in its collapse, the memory of Cnut's empire lingered. To later generations, it would appear as a vision of what might have been, a fleeting unity across the seas, a moment when the Viking world and the Anglo-Saxon kingdom were bound together. Its fall was a reminder of the fragility of power built on one man's shoulders. Its memory was a monument to the rare moment when a king of the north had ruled as master of three realms, and to the truth that without such a king, the empire could not endure. And as the empire crumbled, England itself drifted back into turmoil. The collapse of Cnut's empire left England adrift, and in the years that followed, the kingdom slid once more into the familiar rhythms of uncertainty. The strong hand that had unified lands across the sea was gone, and with his passing, the fragile peace of the North Sea world gave way to rivalry, ambition, and shifting allegiances. England, for a brief moment part of a northern empire, now found itself returning to the turbulence of dynastic struggle. After the short and troubled reigns of Cnut's sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, the line of Danish kings in England came to an abrupt end. In 1042, the throne passed back to the ancient royal house of Wessex, with the accession of Edward, later known as Edward the Confessor. His rise marked a turning point, the restoration of a native dynasty after nearly 3 decades of Danish rule. To many, it felt as though the kingdom had returned to its rightful lineage, but the reality was more complicated. Edward was deeply shaped by his years of exile in Normandy. Having spent much of his youth across the Channel, he carried with him not only personal ties, but cultural sympathies that would bind England's fate to that of the Norman Duchy. The court of Edward reflected this duality. Anglo-Saxon traditions remained strong, yet Norman influence seeped in through language, custom, and alliances. The restoration of Wessex thus carried within it the seeds of a new kind of entanglement, one that would have profound consequences for the future. The reign of Edward the Confessor was remembered for its piety and relative peace, yet beneath the surface lay the unresolved question of succession. Edward had no children, and as he aged, uncertainty over who would inherit the throne grew sharper. The great noble house of Godwin, led by Earl Godwin and later his son Harold, became central to the politics of the kingdom. Their power rivaled that of the king himself, and in Harold Godwinson, England possessed a leader strong enough to command armies and inspire loyalty. But strength without clarity of inheritance was a dangerous thing. Across the Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, watched closely. Bound by blood ties and by Edward's early years in exile, William claimed that the English king had promised him the succession. Whether promise or ambition, William's claim would become the rallying cry for Norman designs on England. In the interplay between Harold Godwinson, the great Earl of England, and William, the formidable Duke of Normandy, lay the storm that would break in 1066. Thus, the restoration of the House of Wessex, far from bringing stability, set the stage for one of the most dramatic contests in English history. The kingdom, which had once bowed to a Danish king, now faced the looming possibility of conquest from across the Channel. The death of Cnut had ended the North Sea Empire. The death of Edward would open the door to the Norman conquest. In this way, the fall of Cnut's dynasty did not merely mark the end of one empire, but the beginning of the struggles that would reshape England forever. Out of the ruins of Anglo-Danish rule rose the restored Wessex line, but its fragility ensured that the peace was only temporary. The road now led inexorably toward 1066 Hastings and the forging of yet another new order. Yet before the storm of 1066, England still carried the memory of Cnut's reign, a legacy too great to be forgotten. Cnut the Great's reign closed as one of the most extraordinary chapters in the long story of medieval England. Few kings before or after him would command such an improbable empire, spanning 3 kingdoms and linked by the restless waters of the North Sea. And yet, his legacy was never confined to the fragile structure of his dominion. Long after his empire had dissolved, Cnut remained a figure of memory, myth, and meaning, a king whose reign redefined what it meant to rule in England. His most immediate legacy was the peace he had brought to a kingdom long riven by war. For decades before his conquest, England had been scarred by Viking raids and dynastic weakness. Under Cnut, that cycle ended. Merchants traveled more freely, churches stood in safety, and farmers plowed their fields with greater certainty. Though his empire collapsed swiftly after his death, the memory of stability endured. Chroniclers and poets alike recorded that his rule, however foreign in origin, brought a measure of order that the English had sorely needed. Cnut also reshaped the very idea of kingship. He was not merely a conqueror imposing his will, but a ruler who understood the need for law, legitimacy, and sanctity. By supporting the church, by issuing codes that combined Anglo-Saxon custom with Scandinavian discipline, he placed himself in continuity with the kings who came before, while also stamping his authority as a new kind of monarch. He was both Viking and Christian king, both foreigner and lawgiver. That paradox became his strength, and it offered a model of rulership that others would seek, in different ways, to imitate. The memory of his piety and his relationship with the church also endured. Tales of his pilgrimage to Rome, his gifts to Canterbury, Ely, and Winchester, and his devotion to the faith were retold across generations. Even the famous story of Cnut and the Tide, whether rooted in truth or later invention, captured the essence of how he was remembered. A king conscious of the limits of his power, a ruler humble before the eternal order of God. This legend, passed down through centuries, ensured that his name, lived not only in chronicles, but in parables that shaped the cultural imagination of England. Yet his reign left deeper legacies as well. The blending of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian traditions under his rule created a cultural synthesis that outlived his dynasty. In architecture, in law, in language, and in custom, the mark of the Anglo-Danish age could still be felt long after the empire's collapse. Place names, loanwords, and hybrid traditions testified to a moment when two worlds were forced into coexistence, and out of that coexistence, something lasting was born. Cnut's story also offered a lesson about the fragility of power. His empire, vast and dazzling, dissolved within a generation because it rested so heavily upon his own person. He had been the linchpin that held England, Denmark, and Norway together. Without him, there was no structure strong enough to keep them united. This truth was not lost on later rulers and chroniclers. The North Sea Empire became a warning as much as an inspiration, a vision of unity that showed what might be achieved, and a reminder of how quickly it could vanish. In England itself, the memory of Cnut provided both contrast and precedent. When Edward the Confessor restored the House of Wessex, he did so in the shadow of Cnut's reign, mindful of the balance between English tradition and foreign influence. When William of Normandy claimed the throne in 1066, he too followed in Cnut's footsteps, presenting himself not as a mere conqueror, but as a legitimate Christian ruler who would protect law and church. The Norman conquest in some sense echoed the earlier Danish conquest, and Cnut's example lingered in the political imagination. Even centuries later, historians and poets continued to reflect upon his rule. To some, he was the Viking king who had brought stability. To others, he was the foreigner whose empire collapsed. To yet others, he was a Christian monarch whose humility before the sea symbolized the eternal truth that no power on earth was absolute. The variety of these memories reveals the richness of his legacy. Not a single story, but many, each reflecting a different facet of his reign. In the end, Cnut's greatest achievement was perhaps not the empire he built, but the transformation he embodied. He began as the son of a Viking invader and ended as a king, laid to rest among the rulers of England. He arrived as a conqueror and departed as a lawgiver, remembered in prayers and chronicles. His empire may have been fleeting, but his reign showed that conquest could give way to continuity, that the foreign could become familiar, and that even the most unlikely king could leave behind a legacy written not only in war, but in law, faith, and memory. Thus, the story of Cnut the Great is both triumph and caution. It tells of a man who reached heights few could imagine, who united crowns across the sea, and who gave peace to a land weary of war. It also tells of the fragility of power built on one life, and of the inevitability of change when that life ends. Yet across the centuries, his name endures, as the Viking who became an English king, as the ruler of a northern empire, and as the figure who, for a brief but brilliant moment, reshaped the destiny of England.